At 0317 hours, the Strait of Hormuz was holding its breath. The water was black glass, no wind, the kind of stillness that experienced sailors learn to distrust, the kind that settles over a stretch of ocean right before something irreversible happens. A thin layer of humidity pressed down on the Persian Gulf like a wool blanket soaked in engine oil, and the stars above the strait were the only things moving, barely. Visibility was 6 nautical miles in haze. Surface temperature, 31 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of brine and aviation fuel and something else. A low-frequency tension that veteran officers describe as the moment the situation stops being theoretical. Somewhere to the northwest, 12 kilometers off the Iranian coastline near Bandar Abbas, something had just gone active on radar. Something fast, something that was not supposed to be there. And somewhere 87 nautical miles to the south-southwest, 5,000 men and women aboard USS Abraham Lincoln were about to find out whether the last 96 hours of preparation were enough. I'm your host at US Defense Watch, where we cut through the noise and break down the operations that define global security in the 21st century. And what you're about to hear is not a near miss or a close call that got buried in a Pentagon press briefing. This is the story of a hypersonic missile launch inside one of the most contested waterways on the planet, a carrier strike group that had been waiting with a loaded weapon system for 4 days, and an 8-minute response window that the United States Navy closed in under half that time. Stay with me, because the details matter. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had been restless for weeks before this night. Heightened patrols in the Eastern Gulf. Aggressive radio chatter on maritime frequencies that U.S. signals intelligence had been logging and analyzing every hour. 2 near-miss intercepts with U.S. patrol vessels in the previous 9 days that both sides, for their own reasons, chose not to escalate publicly. But the pattern was clear to anyone reading the intelligence traffic with sober eyes. The IRGC wasn't just posturing, they were rehearsing. And on this particular night, they weren't running patrols at all. They were running a strike operation that had been planned, war-gamed, and approved at the highest levels of the Iranian military command structure. The weapon was a Fatah-1 hypersonic ballistic missile, Iran's most advanced standoff strike asset, unveiled to international audiences by Iranian state media with considerable fanfare and strategic intent. The Fatah-1 carries a solid fuel propulsion system, reaches a maximum range of 1,400 kilometers, and enters its terminal phase at velocities between Mach 13 and Mach 15, roughly 16,000 kilometers per hour at impact. But raw speed is not its primary design feature. What makes the Fatah-1 genuinely dangerous, what makes it different from an older generation ballistic round, is its maneuvering re-entry vehicle. The warhead does not follow a fixed ballistic arc. It corrects, it displaces. It changes its descent angle and lateral position in the terminal phase specifically to defeat kinetic interceptors that have been computing an intercept solution based on a predicted trajectory. Iranian engineers designed this capability after studying years of American ballistic missile defense test data published in open literature and obtained through various intelligence channels. They knew how the SM-3 worked. They built the Fatah-1 to beat it. The IRGC had positioned 2 mobile transporter erector launchers, TELs, on elevated ground 34 kilometers northeast of Bandar Abbas in a terrain fold that provided natural radar masking from naval surface search systems operating in the southern Gulf. The TELs had driven to their firing positions under darkness 61 hours prior, moving without headlights on roads that Iranian military engineers had scouted and mapped for exactly this scenario. Once in position, the crews pulled thermal suppression netting over both vehicles, military-grade material designed to reduce infrared emission signatures to ambient background levels. They maintained strict electronic silence from the moment the vehicle stopped moving. No active radar, no radio transmissions, no mobile phones. The launch commander communicated through a physical relay system using prearranged light signals between vehicles. It was meticulous operational security. It reflected genuine capability and genuine seriousness of intent. The IRGC crew was not improvising. They believed they had achieved surprise. Every decision they had made over the preceding 61 hours was built on that assumption. The target was USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, the 97,000-ton Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier operating in international waters, 87 nautical miles south-southwest of the launch position. The Lincoln had been conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Strait of Hormuz for 19 consecutive days as part of a broader regional deterrence posture. She was carrying 64 aircraft, a crew of more than 5,000 personnel, and enough aviation fuel and ordnance to sustain 30 days of continuous air operations. She was also, at that moment, the most heavily defended object within 300 nautical miles in any direction. At 0312 hours, the first TEL crew began its final pre-launch checklist. Hydraulic erectors raised the Fata-1 to vertical. Fire control systems came online for the first time since the vehicles had parked 61 hours earlier. The brief electronic emission that accompanied system activation lasted less than 4 seconds before the crew reverted to internal communications. At 0316 hours and 44 seconds, the IRGC launch commander gave the order. The first Fata-1 left the rail on a bearing of 157 degrees magnetic, climbing steeply into the black sky above the strait on a column of white exhaust visible from 40 kilometers away. The two-man launch crew exchanged a look. Then they began preparing the second vehicle. What they didn't know was that U.S. Navy and intelligence assets had been tracking both TELs continuously for 96 hours. A P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, Bureau number 169340, operating under full emissions control protocols at 28,000 feet on a racetrack pattern northeast of the strait, had first acquired the thermal signature of both TELs at 1847 hours. 4 days prior to the launch, the P-8's AN/APS-154 advanced airborne sensor detected the residual engine heat of the vehicles during a scheduled infrared survey pass, even through the thermal suppression netting. The netting reduced the signature. It did not eliminate it. The crew flagged the contact within minutes and transmitted encrypted targeting coordinates to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. The National Reconnaissance Office tasked 2 imaging satellites to the grid reference within the hour. Imagery analysts at NSA Bahrain cross-referenced the vehicle silhouettes against a classified database of known IRGC mobile launch platforms and confirmed the identification of both TELs within 40 minutes of the initial detection. SOSUS hydrophone arrays positioned along the floor of the Persian Gulf had been supplemented 3 days earlier by a string of AN/SSQ-62 directional passive sonar buoys deployed by a second P-8 sortie, sealing off the underwater approaches in case the missile strike was being coordinated with an IRGC submarine operation. It was not, but the U.S. Navy does not assume. It verifies. USS Abraham Lincoln's Combat Direction Center had been elevated to DEFCON Bravo, 1 step below maximum readiness, since 0100 hours that morning. Based on intelligence indicators compiled over the preceding 18 hours, Iranian naval radio traffic had shifted from its normal patrol coordination patterns to an encrypted waveform associated in NSA databases with pre-strike coordination cycles. A human intelligence source inside the IRGC had provided corroborating reporting 14 hours earlier. The carrier's commanding officer had been briefed. The strike group had been repositioned to optimize defensive geometry. The weapon systems that would decide the next 7 minutes had already been warmed, aligned, and cleared for autonomous engagement under 5th Fleet Standing Rules of Engagement. Carrier Strike Group 3, CSG-3, was disposed as follows. USS Lake Champlain, CG-57, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, was positioned 6.2 nautical miles off Lincoln's port beam. Lake Champlain carries 122 Mk-41 VLS cells, and her AN/SPY-1B radar provides 360-degree ballistic missile tracking coverage to ranges exceeding 500 kilometers. USS Sterett, DDG-104, an Arleigh Burke-class Flight 2A guided missile destroyer, was operating 9.4 nautical miles to the southwest. Assigned lower-tier terminal defense coverage with her RIM-116, rolling airframe missile launchers, and phalanx CIWS systems. USS William P. Lawrence DDG-110, a second Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, was running 14 nautical miles to the northeast in a forward picket position, assigned the dual mission of early warning relay and, if required, ground strike tasking against the TEL positions using Tomahawk land attack missiles. Every ship in the formation knew its role. At 0316 hours and 52 seconds, exactly 8 seconds after the Fatah 1 left its launcher, the AN/SPY-1B aboard USS Lake Champlain achieved firm track on the inbound missile. The contact was classified automatically by the ship's Aegis combat management system as a maneuvering ballistic missile, consistent with the Fatah-class threat profile that had been preloaded into the system 48 hours earlier, based on intelligence updates from 5th Fleet. The verbal call-out in the Combat Information Center was immediate and precise. Ballistic missile launch bearing 337, classify Fatah-class hypersonic, track Sierra 7, inbound bearing 153, time to impact 7 minutes 14 seconds, evaluating now. 7 minutes and 14 seconds. The Combat Direction Center watch officer on USS Abraham Lincoln received the full track data through the Cooperative Engagement Capability data link in that same second. He did not reach for a phone. He did not wait for a second opinion. The rules of engagement pre-authorized under 5th Fleet operational orders permitted autonomous defensive fire without carrier authorization for inbound ballistic threats assessed as hostile. The system was architected to move faster than command hierarchy in exactly this scenario. At 0316 hours and 55 seconds, Lake Champlain's AN/MK99 fire control system completed its intercept geometry solution and flagged the engagement window as valid. At 0316 hours and 58 seconds, 14 seconds after missile launch, the engagement order was generated automatically and passed to the Mark 41 vertical launch system. At 0317 hours and 09 seconds, the first RIM-161 Standard Missile 3 Block 2A SM-3 cleared Lake Champlain's forward VLS array. The round exited the cell traveling at 9,200 feet per second on a computed intercept trajectory that anticipated the Fatah 1's projected position at 108 kilometers altitude, 3 minutes and 47 seconds from now. A second SM-3 was queued and held in reserve as a salvo backup. The crew did not pause to assess the launch. 3 sailors in the after VLS module were already running pre-flight checks on the standby round. The phalanx CIWS arrays on all 3 surface combatants had shifted to automatic acquisition mode at the moment of ballistic track acquisition. The fight was not assumed to be over. The Fatah 1 performed exactly as designed. At burnout plus 97 seconds, the maneuvering re-entry vehicle separated from the boost stage and began its terminal descent phase. At 0319 hours and 33 seconds, the MARV activated its lateral correction thrusters and executed a programmed displacement of 4.7 kilometers to the northeast of its predicted ballistic trajectory, a maneuver calculated to force any interceptor that had been tracking the boost phase arc to resolve its geometry in the final seconds of the engagement window. The displacement happened in 1.8 seconds. Iranian engineers had run this scenario thousands of times in simulation. The capability was real. It was their best answer to American missile defense, and it was being tracked in real time by a sensor network that never lost the contact. The Cooperative Engagement Capability Network linking Lake Champlain, Starrett, Lawrence, and the Lincoln's own Aegis suite updated the SM-3's intercept solution through the missile's in-flight data uplink at a rate of 18 corrections per second. The kill vehicle on board the SM-3 received the corrected intercept geometry 2.3 seconds after the Fatah 1's MARV executed its displacement maneuver. The kinematic solution adjusted in real time. The interceptor altered its flight path. At 0320 hours and 17 seconds, at an altitude of 112 kilometers above the dark waters of the Strait of Hormuz, in the exoatmosphere, in complete silence where there is no air and no sound and no witnesses, the SM-3's hit-to-kill vehicle made direct kinetic contact with the Fatah 1's maneuvering re-entry vehicle. No warhead detonation, no fragmentation. Pure kinetic energy at a combined closing velocity of approximately 22,400 kilometers per hour. The Fatah 1 ceased to exist as a coherent object in 0.003 seconds. Debris tracking was initiated automatically. The Combat Direction Center logged 23 separate fragment tracks within 8 seconds of the intercept event. Trajectory analysis for all 23 fragments was completed within 11 seconds. None of the fragments posed a threat to surface vessels. The threat axis was clear. Elapsed time from launch detection to kinetic intercept, 3 minutes and 25 seconds. Time remaining on the original projected impact clock at the moment of intercept, 3 minutes and 49 seconds. USS Abraham Lincoln had been inside the active threat window for less than 4 minutes. Her crew had never gone to general quarters. The ship had not maneuvered. The aircraft on her flight deck had not been scrambled. The response had been executed entirely by the cruiser and destroyer screen at the outermost layer of the defensive envelope, exactly as the layered architecture was designed to work. The second IRGC TEL, the follow-on launch asset positioned 800 meters northwest of the primary firing point, never fired its missile. Signals intelligence collected in the 11 minutes immediately following the intercept detected a brief encrypted radio transmission from the second TEL's communication system. It was the first radio emission either vehicle had produced since arriving at the position 61 hours earlier. What that transmission said has not been confirmed in open-source reporting. What is known is that USS William P. Lawrence had computed a Tomahawk land attack missile firing solution against both TEL grid coordinates within 90 seconds of the initial ballistic track acquisition, and had transmitted a complete targeting package to 5th Fleet Headquarters for strike authorization. That authorization was referred up the chain of command and was not acted upon that night. At approximately 0338 hours, the second TEL broke down its thermal suppression netting and withdrew westward under its own power on secondary roads toward Bandar Abbas. Satellite imagery tracked the withdrawal in real time. The vehicle was allowed to leave. The decision to not prosecute the second TEL was a political and strategic calculation, not a capability limitation. That distinction matters. By 0347 hours, USS Abraham Lincoln had returned her Combat Direction Center to normal steaming condition. The watch rotation continued on schedule. Lake Champlain's forward VLS cells were being restocked from magazine reserves. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopters on the carrier's flight deck had never left their tie-down chains. The Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes had stayed in their magazines. The Phalanx CIWS systems had never cycled to autonomous engagement mode. Not because the crew was unprepared to use them, but because the threat was resolved at the outermost defensive layer before any of those inner ring systems were required. That is not luck. That is architecture built over 30 years of investment in layered fleet defense. Inside the Combat Direction Center, the post-engagement debrief began before the debris had finished its descent. Officers were already reviewing the 4.7-kilometer MIRV displacement, comparing it against the threat models loaded into the system 48 hours prior, and updating engagement parameters for future scenarios. The debrief was not celebratory, it was clinical. The system had worked, which meant the crew was already focused on the millimeter of margin between success and a different outcome. And they were building that margin into every assumption going forward. What happened above the Strait of Hormuz that night revealed 3 truths about modern naval power that deserve to be stated plainly and permanently. The first is that surveillance dominance in contested maritime environments is now effectively absolute for the United States military. The IRGC maintained 61 hours of electronic silence, used military-grade thermal suppression, moved under complete darkness, and communicated through physical signal relays specifically to avoid triggering American sensor networks. None of it worked. The surveillance architecture, combining imaging satellites, P-8 Poseidon infrared and acoustic sensors, SOSUS hydrophone arrays, and human intelligence sources, sees through denial attempts that would have been fully effective against any adversary 2 decades ago. You cannot hide a TEL from an infrastructure that detects the heat differential between a camouflaged vehicle and the surrounding ground temperature from low Earth orbit. The second truth is that the integration of fire control networks across U.S. Navy hull types has produced a response speed that no human decision cycle can match or exploit. The 14-second interval between launch detection and SM-3 firing was not a fast-thinking officer making a rapid call. It was an automated system executing a pre-authorized engagement plan developed, tested, and loaded into the combat management architecture days before the threat arrived. The Iranians designed a strike assuming human reaction time as their window of opportunity. They were wrong about what they were fighting. The third truth is the most consequential of all. The gap between what a regional military power can field as its most advanced strike system and what a U.S. carrier strike group can absorb and defeat in routine operations is not narrowing. The Fatah 1 was Iran's best available answer to American naval presence in the Gulf. Years in development, maneuvering capable, hypersonic, specifically engineered to defeat the SM-3. It was intercepted at 112 kilometers altitude, in darkness, in 3 minutes and 25 seconds, by a cruiser that never altered course. That asymmetry is structural. It cannot be reversed quickly. And any force that believes a quiet approach and a fast weapon changes the fundamental equation of power in the Persian Gulf has now received a very clear, very permanent, and very high-altitude answer. This is U.S. Defense Watch. If this breakdown gave you something real, share it with someone who needs to understand what modern deterrence actually looks like. The next analysis is already in progress.